Good afternoon. I'm very excited to welcome you to the 2018 OSEP Symposia series. This year, we're highlighting the very important role that developing and implementing high-quality IEPs plays in ensuring that each child with a disability can be successful. There are 3 symposia in the series, and they are interconnected. We'll start by laying the policy and research foundation to establish a common understanding and set of principles. Next, we will explore what high-quality IEPs mean in practice, delving deeper into what teachers, leaders, and IEP teams need to develop and implement high-quality IEPs, and how we can support these needs. Finally, we will explore how education agencies, families, and other stakeholders are working together to develop and implement high-quality IEPs. Today's symposium will focus on the importance of IEPs, high expectations, and appropriate supports. Today's speakers come with a diverse experience and depth of knowledge in many areas. They include current OSEP grantees discussing factors that drive high expectations, such as child, family, and other stakeholder engagement, and the support children and families need to meet those expectations. Supporting states to ensure that each child has access to an education that best meets her or his unique and individual needs. How high expectations relate to state academic content standards, and how we can support states and LEAs to incorporate evidence-based practices in the IEP. We definitely have a rich and engaging discussion planned for you today. As explained earlier, today's event is centered around the role that high-quality IEPs play in ensuring that each child with a disability can be successful. To really dig into this topic, we have expertise and perspectives from across the spectrum, including our Assistant Secretary, which we will hear from in a moment, a Special Education Director of an SEA, an IDEA scholar, professors supporting educators to meet the needs of children who have intensive needs by working from their strengths in both early childhood and K-12 settings. We will also hear from parents of children with disabilities, one who leads a parent center and the other a general education teacher. It's a wide breadth of expertise meant to emphasize the critical role all of you play in ensuring children with disabilities are held to high expectations and given the appropriate supports needed to carry out high-quality IEPs. So without further delay, our first speaker today is our Assistant Secretary in the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services at the United States Department of Education, Collett. In his capacity, he serves as the advisor to the Secretary of Education on matters related to the education of children and youth with disabilities, as well as employment and community living for youth and adults with disabilities. Welcome, Assistant Secretary Collett.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us today. It is my honor to lead the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services and its ongoing mission to improve early childhood educational and employment outcomes and raise expectations for all people with disabilities and their communities, their families, and the nation. So in OSERS, we are incredibly excited about this mission and committed to the ongoing progress in this mission. I'm often struck by the notion that OSERS really is unique because we work to impact positively really across the life of an individual with disability, from birth through adulthood, including post-secondary opportunities and competitive integrated employment. So we are deeply committed to continue to make progress in our mission, and we are committed to ensuring that all people with disabilities have positive outcomes educationally, early childhood, and employment. But you know, as many of you have probably heard me say, there's really only one way for all to mean all. For all to mean all, it has to mean each. So in OSERS, we are deeply committed to supporting states in their work to ensure that each child has what they need when they need it to be successful and has access to an education that best meets his or her needs. We're committed to calling attention in this work to both high expectations and appropriate supports, not one without the other. And that's part of why I'm so excited that you're participating in this event today. Consistent with the Secretary's final supplemental priorities for discretionary grants, we will focus on meeting the unique needs of students and children with disabilities, ensuring that they have opportunity to meet challenging objectives, and receive an educational program that is both meaningful and appropriate in light of their circumstances. Also consistent with the Secretary's final supplemental priorities for discretionary grants around around promoting effective instruction in classroom and schools. We will be mindful of both the initial preparation and ongoing capacity needs of teachers, leaders, and others who work every day to ensure that students, children with disabilities can have what they need when they need it to be successful. As you know very well, IDEA emphasizes the importance of high expectations. It also emphasizes the importance of strengthening the role of parents and ensuring that families have meaningful opportunities to participate in the education of their children at school and at home. These principles, we believe, were reinforced by the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in the Andrew F. case, a landmark decision for millions of children and youth with disabilities and their families in our country. As you know, Andrew F., in the case Andrew F., the court held that a school must offer an IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress in light of the child's circumstances. The court additionally emphasized the requirement that every child should have a chance to meet challenging objectives. While the court did not specifically define, quote, in light of the child's circumstances, end quote, the decision emphasized the individualized nature and decision-making required in the IEP process and the need to ensure that every child, not some children, not most children, but that every child should have a chance to meet challenging objectives and be supported to make progress toward achieving them. It's part of why the department released in December 2017 the questions and answers document on the Andrew case to inform families and educators and administrators of the impact of the court's decision. As Secretary DeVos has made clear and as will continue to be committed to, tolerating low expectations and accepting failure and a one-size-fits-all approach to educating children and youth with disabilities is not acceptable. We must do better by demonstrating that we do have hope for them and that we do believe in them. And we will work very hard to support you in the work that you're leading, to do that every day. In doing that work to support you, we will remain mindful of the appropriate federal role in supporting states to do the work that they, with their stakeholders, have envisioned to improve results and outcomes for children and youth with disabilities. And that decisions like these are best made by those closest to the child. So in summarizing my few remarks this morning or this afternoon, I'm proud of the progress we've made since Congress first passed Public Law 94-142, now IDEA, more than 40 years ago. And I'm committed that we will continue implementing that law. We will implement that law, but we will ensure at the same time, simultaneously, that we are focusing on raising expectations and improving outcomes for all people with disabilities, their families, their communities, and the nation. While we should celebrate our progress, and we will, we're going to remain mindful every day that we still have much to do together to ensure that each child, youth, and adult with a disability has what they need when they need it to be successful and be prepared for their next right step. So I'll leave you with this. While we all have a stake in the success of the individuals that we serve, no one has more of a stake in their success than they do. And I'm committed, and we at OSERS are committed, and the department is committed to supporting you and working with you on their behalf. And I'm excited about the opportunity we have today to talk about the important role of developing and implementing quality IEPs plays in the success of students with disabilities, the success that we, but most importantly, the success that they envision. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johnny. A significant goal today is that you come away with an understanding of N through F, specifically what it means for your work and how you can positively impact outcomes for children with disabilities, how N through F standard can and is being implemented, and how OSEP-funded efforts support this standard, how the IEP can be used to ensure a focus on high expectations and appropriate supports, and the role you can play in setting high expectations for children with disabilities and supporting states to help children achieve those high expectations. Our next speaker will be Dr. Mitchell Yell. Dr. Yell will talk through high expectations and individualized supports to meet the NJUF standard. By the way, I encourage you to read the full biographies of each of our speakers. Their work is fascinating, and you're only going to get a glimpse of their achievements today. Dr. Yell is the Fred and Frances Lester Palmetto Chair in Teacher Education and a professor in special education at the University of South Carolina. His professional interests include special education law, IEP development, progress monitoring, and parent involvement in special education. Welcome, Dr. Mitchell-Yell.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is Mitch Yell, and I am a professor at the University of South Carolina in special education. I'm also a level 2 hearing officer and reviews due process hearings in the state. So what I think is important is that I create a little bit of context for the Andrew decision first off. So as Johnny was mentioning, 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed by the name is now the Individuals with Education Disabilities Act. But when that law was passed, it required that special educators deliver a free, appropriate public education to all youngsters with disabilities who were determined eligible under this law. Well, a FAPE was not defined in an extraordinarily clear manner by Congress, but what they did is they defined it more in terms of what is in the IEP. In fact, the definition of FAPE states specifically that a FAPE is special education related services provided in conformity with a student's individualized education program. Thus, the IEP is the embodiment or the blueprint of a child's FAPE. Now, over the years, this question of what exactly is a FAPE has been litigated quite frequently in due process hearings and in court cases. And in fact, in 1982, the Supreme Court addressed their first special education case specifically defining what a free appropriate public education is in the case of Board of Education v. Rowley. That decision was, like I said, the first special education decision. It involved a young girl named Amy Rowley. Now, Amy was quite bright, had 125 IQ. She was also academically very able, did very well in school, but she was profoundly deaf. As a result, the parents, when they had Amy first attend a public elementary school, requested that the school district provide a sign language interpreter for her. However, the school district did not provide a sign language interpreter. Parents believing that because she was profoundly deaf, she really needed the services in order to receive a free, appropriate public education. Well, the parents requested a due process hearing, which eventually wound up in a U.S. federal district court. And the district court decided that in order to provide a FAPE, the school district did have to provide a sign language interpreter for Amy so that she could receive the full benefit of her education and, in essence, receive an education equal to those provided to non-disabled students. Well, the parents or the school district then appealed to the United States Circuit Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, which upheld the lower court in deciding for Amy that, in fact, the school district had not provided her with a FAPE. The school district then appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and in the first decision that they were to hear on special education, they set forth a two-part test, which is our next slide. And their two-part test was as follows. First, any court or any hearing officer who is ruling on a FAPE case has to first ask, were the procedures of the law followed? And the second question is regarding the IEP. Is the IEP reasonably calculated to enable a student to receive educational benefit? Now, every lower court judge, every due process hearing officer like myself who does a FAPE case is going to have to answer these two questions. In the Rowley case, the two questions were posed by the Supreme Court, and they believed that the school district had followed the procedures of the law well, and so then they turned to the second part of the test, and kind of this was where the real problem lied, because Amy was not your typical special education child. She had a very high IQ, she was doing very well in school. So the Supreme Court essentially was able to bypass or sidestep the question about educational benefit. And in fact, they decided in favor of the school district because they said, well, Amy was passing from grade to grade. Clearly, she must be receiving educational benefit. Although they did also specifically mention in a footnote that we are only talking about Amy here. Nonetheless, in future cases that have been heard on FAPE, what has happened is school district or courts have tended to interpret this a little differently. It's never been difficult for the courts to decide if the procedures were followed. What has been more difficult, however, is deciding if a child received educational benefit. Now, on the next slide, you can see that the U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeal, which are the courts right under the United States Supreme Court, have ruled in different ways when addressing the educational benefit. Two circuits, the third and the sixth, said that a school had to provide a higher degree of benefit. They had to provide meaningful educational benefit. However, six circuits used a much lower standard, saying that a school provided FAPE by meeting the procedures and providing some educational benefit. However, in the 10th Circuit decision, which is the next slide, perhaps the lowest of standards was announced in the 10th Circuit by the United States Courts of Appeal for the 10th Circuit. And that is that educational benefit mandated by the idea must merely be more than de minimis. De minimis being a Latin term standing for trivial. When we apply that to courts, what it means, if courts have issues before them that are de minimis, they don't even have to really acknowledge those because they're just trivial matters that are no importance. So in essence, what the 10th Circuit seemed to be saying is a school could provide educational benefit that was mandated by the law merely by providing educational benefit that was slightly more than nothing. Well, a case came up in 2010 involving a young boy named Andrew F. And Andrew F. Was a young boy with autism. He had severe academic problems and severe behavioral problems. He was educated in the Douglas County School District from preschool all the way to 4th grade, and he did have IEPs. In 4th grade, his parents became increasingly upset with the school district because academically his behavior was stalled, and additionally his academics were stalled and his behavior was becoming quite severe. So what they did is they pulled Andrew and put him in a private school called the Firefly Autism House. They educated him for a year there. He did fairly well. Nonetheless, because of this low educational benefit standard, they decided to go to court to get attorney's fees, and unfortunately, using this low benefit standard, lost at the due process level, the district court level, and the U.S. Court of Appeals. So on the next slide, what we see is the parents, undaunted, filed a petition with the U.S. Supreme Court asking, what is the level of educational benefit school districts must confer on children with disabilities to provide them with a FAPE? Supreme Court granted certiorari, which means they would hear the case. And on January 11th, 8 members of the Supreme Court, which is the next slide, 8 members of the Supreme Court heard the decision. Neil Gorsuch had not yet been approved. And then on March 22nd, the Supreme Court issued a ruling. On the next slide, you see that Chief Justice John Roberts, essentially the Supreme Court in a unanimous decision vacated the decisions of the lower court and had a new higher standard, which is the following: to meet its substantive obligation under the idea a school must offer an IEP reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. This decision meant the following: there is now an more or less a Rowley-Andrew test, which is the next slide. In the first test is really from Rowley, and the second, which is the procedural test. The second test is the substantive test, or is the IEP reasonably calculated? That was the next slide. In the Rowley-Andrew test, every due process hearing officer, every judge will have to apply that new standard in FAPE cases. Now, if we go to the next slide, the U.S. District Court actually decided that, because this decision was actually remanded, the U.S. District Court overturned their previous decision, saying that the school district, in light of this clarified standard, had not provided a free, appropriate public education and had ordered the school district to pay for tuition reimbursement and court costs and attorney's fees. So there are some wonderful references we'll be talking about today, and I refer you all to them. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yell. Our next set of speakers will lead a discussion on how to support each child's individual needs. Dr. Karen Erickson is the director of the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies, a professor in the Division of Speech and Hearing Sciences, and the Yoder Distinguished Professor in the Department of Allied Health Sciences at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's a former teacher of students with significant disabilities whose current research addresses literacy and communication for students with significant cognitive disabilities. We also have Dr. Kelly Henderson. She's the executive director of Formed Families Forward, a Northern Virginia nonprofit family organization that trains and supports foster, adoptive, and kinship care families raising children and youth with special needs. Formed Families Forward operates a community parent resource center funded by the U.S. Office of Special Education Programs and is a family partner to the Virginia Tiered Systems of Support Project. And then following that, we have a video about the importance of challenging objectives from Sarah Helena Vazquez, who is a motivational speaker, an advocate, and author who holds a master's degree in disability studies. She's a true believer that anyone can pave their life's path by way of having dreams. With the support of her mother, who instilled in her that she should be defined by her abilities, not by her disability. Today, Vazquez is sure that she was born with cerebral palsy to change the face of what having a disability looks like. With the confidence she gained from her mother and the high expectations of her teachers, Vazquez is now regarded as one of the nation's leading advocates for people with disabilities. Please welcome Dr. Erickson, Dr. Henderson, and the video from Sarah Vazquez.
Thank you. My work for more than 30 years has focused on improving the academic outcomes, specifically literacy outcomes, for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. As a teacher in the late 1980s, I was among the first generation of special educators to embrace assistive technology, including augmentative and alternative communication, as a way to improve and successfully support each child and help them meet the high expectations we held. As a researcher in 2018, I continue to focus on the power of assistive technology, augmentative communication, and literacy to help students meet the high expectations we hold. Next slide. One more slide. From the beginning of my career, I've pushed back on the way I was required to write IEPs and the way I and many of my colleagues were encouraged to implement them. I have pushed back on the notion that mastery of skills is the sole indicator of academic success, not just for students with the complex support needs that I work with, but for all students. What I noticed was that I could apply many different methods in order to help my students achieve mastery, but to what end? As was the case nearly 30 years ago, I still see teachers setting aside a time in their day to teach IEP goals or objectives or benchmarks to mastery. But I argue that most of the skills that are taught in that way, one-on-one, working on it to mastery in the isolation of their meaningful application, it's not helping our students achieve the type of high expectations that we have. Certainly, all students, whether they have disabilities or not, should master a variety of skills. But most students master those skills as a result of a variety of learning opportunities that extend well beyond the skills themselves. It's not a result of focused instruction on the skills. Next slide. Today, I still see IEP after IEP that seeks consistency and mastery of skills identified by teams. Usually, that consistency or mastery is reflected in benchmarks or objectives that end with a criteria of 80% accuracy on 4 out of 5 days, or trials, or opportunities. I've certainly seen a positive shift towards academic goals that link to grade level standards, and that is very encouraging. However, the goals, benchmarks, and objectives address skills that are often so disconnected from the overall intent of our standards that they have little meaning and do little to help students progress through the grades in a meaningful way. When I first learned about UDL, I was overjoyed with the idea that it might lead to a change in the way we craft IEPs. The emphasis on multiple and flexible, that's the hallmark of UDL, left me hopeful that we might be able to move away from narrowly defined IEP goals and benchmarks and objectives that specify the rigid conditions under which a child would demonstrate mastery of a skill. I was hopeful that understandings of UDL would go beyond its emphasis on technology to level the playing field to an emphasis on the needs of students to learn skills in multiple and flexible ways that would allow them to express understandings of those skills in multiple and flexible ways. I'm not suggesting that we don't need IEP goals and objectives that are SMART. While SMART is not defined by everybody in the same way, it generally refers to goals and objectives that are specific, measurable, attainable, results-oriented, and time-bound. But SMART goals and objectives do not have to focus on single skills demonstrated to mastery with consistency over time. SMART goals and objectives can reflect the core principles of UDL by allowing students to demonstrate specific skills in multiple and flexible ways, and by allowing teams to measure progress with those skills by seeking increased frequency of success in applying the skills, rather than the 80% mastery of those skills in our trials. As we work to craft IEPs that emphasize multiple and flexible representation, action, expression, and engagement, we also need to shift our focus from skills that we think students can master to the kinds of pivotal skills that they need in order to progress from year to year. The current focus of standards across our country and the findings of NRUF reflect an expectation that learning is going to build over time. Perhaps narrowly focused IEP goals and objectives are one of the factors that keep many students with severe cognitive disabilities from building skills over time and continuing to make academic progress after elementary school. If the standard has been goals and objectives that target skills that we think students can master each year, have we been doing our students a disservice? I still see too many students like this boy. They're approaching adolescence without being able to use speech, signs, or symbols to communicate with the world. They master skills like matching the symbols to preferred objects and foods. They identify symbols with 80% accuracy on 4 out of 5 days. But they do not use symbols to initiate, respond, interact, share information, establish social connections, or communicate for any of the dozens of other reasons that are required for students to achieve academically from year to year to year. Much to our delight, and probably even more so to his, over the last 18 months, there's been a big shift in this boy's IEP and his educational program. He now is learning about not just matching those skills, but using those symbols in order to initiate, share information, and respond to open-ended questions. Now he's successfully using a much larger array of symbols to achieve a much broader set of communication purposes, and his progress across the curriculum has been much clearer. The ability to participate actively and interact with others in the environment is a pivotal skill that is reflected in our current standards across the country. Students are expected to initiate and participate actively and effectively in a range of collaborative discussions about a variety of topics. How does one master the art of initiating and participating with 80% accuracy in 4 out of 5 trials? I would argue that you can't. But we can write IEP goals that focus on getting students who can't initiate to initiate more frequently about a broader range of topics with an increasing range of communication partners. I would argue that we can also write IEP goals that help those students who initiate a little too often learn how to focus those initiations on the topic at hand and to increase their active participation with the group. Finally, as we work to create IEPs that support each student's individual needs while helping them achieve high academic expectations, we must focus our expectations on the application and use of knowledge and skills. Decades of research suggests that students with significant cognitive disabilities struggle to generalize skills as they learn them. But could they be more successful if our IEPs focused not on mastery of skills with 80% accuracy, but instead focused on the use of those skills in novel contexts for novel purposes? Could we be far less concerned that students demonstrate skills in the context of our carefully crafted trials, and instead concern ourselves with looking for the application of those skills where they are needed the most? Could we respond to the demands of current standards and Andrew F. by addressing anchor standards and pivotal skills instead of focusing on skills that we pluck from standards themselves? Could we realize the potential of UDL for all students by building on knowledge and teaching skills in multiple and flexible ways that are required for students to apply and learn as they continue to learn over time? These students and hundreds of others like them have helped me learn that we have no choice. If we are going to help students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, and I would argue all students, reach our highest expectations, we must concern ourselves with creating IEPs that address application and use of pivotal knowledge and skills that build over time to maximize gains from one grade level to the next. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Kelly Henderson, and I have the honor of directing a family-led nonprofit serving Northern Virginia's foster, adoptive, and kinship families. I'm very pleased to be here today and have the opportunity to share a few thoughts on this critical topic. First, a little about OSEP-funded parent centers. As we are all aware, parent and family involvement in special education is fundamental to IDEA. The federal law has emphasized parent participation not only through specific provisions regarding eligibility and IEPs, but also through its commitment to parent and family support and technical assistance. Currently, a total of 65 parent training and information centers serve families in all states and territories. In 1997, Community Parent Resource Centers, or CPRCs, were born in their current form. Today, 26 CPRCs focus on specific underserved populations, such as those in a smaller geographic area, a community with particular language needs, and so on. We at Forum Families Forward work to support foster, adoptive, and kinship families. Kinship care is provided formally or informally by extended family members, such as grandparents, when their parents are unable or unavailable to care for their children. To better understand our perspective on why the individual needs of a child are so central, it might be helpful to know a bit more about foster, adoptive, and kinship families. Collectively, about 14% of children are raised in homes that are not headed by a birth or step-parent. The first bullet on this slide provides that breakdown a bit. While many children in formed families do meet developmental milestones, many do not and have organic and acquired conditions that may require special education and related services. Research supports a disability prevalence of about 3 to 4 times that rate of disabilities in birth families. And outcomes are pretty poor for children and youth with special needs raised in formed families. This challenge has recently been acknowledged as ESSA now includes children in foster care status as a subgroup for disaggregated reporting. The impact of serious, traumatizing experiences on behavioral, social, emotional, and academic readiness has contributed to a historical underachievement of many children and youth in care. So foster, adoptive, and kinship families, for foster, adoptive, and kinship families, the Andrew F. decision offers welcome clarification regarding faith. It offers a strong foundation on which all families can fulfill their advocacy and involvement responsibilities. Diana Auten and of New Jersey Span and others have done some great work on helping families understand the implications of this ruling. In particular, these clarifications remind those of us raising and working with children who experience the greatest barriers to achievement, including those who are disproportionately represented in special education and for whom expectations are often set sadly low, of the power of potential of every child and youth. This is a critical shift in policy and practice to a presumption of progress towards challenging objectives guided by an individual child's specific circumstances, no matter the tough places in their past or present. It serves families, schools, and the broader community well in the immediate and for years to come. So how best to operationalize the faith demanded by NDRU? Families know their children best. They can identify critical strengths and challenges and offer insights to strategies that work and those that don't. The job and the privilege of the IEP team is to really focus in on the needs of that one child and informed by data from past performance, valid evaluation and assessment data, other parent and caregiver engagement. The team can craft a challenging, individualized program that sets the stage for meaningful progress. As the NDRU decision directly states, IEP procedures emphasize collaboration between family and educators and require consideration of individual circumstances. In practice, families want to see some pretty fundamental features honored in IEP planning and implementation. We often talk to families about the concept of P in IEP, a program of services and supports in least restrictive settings. This goal-driven program should assume and account for growth. Goals are central, so the team should dedicate careful consideration to crafting original and complete goals, informed by the family and student directly. Finally, NDRU reminds us that IEPs and the meetings to develop and review a child's individualized program is about content first. It is an occasion, at least annually, to define and renew our collective commitment to the child, to his or her teachers and staff, and to his or her family to meet challenging and individualized goals.
Hi, my name is Vazquez, and when I think about having expectations for students with IEPs, I recall an event in my life. I was a senior in college, and I was used to advocating for myself. But I had this one professor that told me that every time I spoke up in class, she would pass me by. And I had to think about what she was really saying to me. And I found myself in front of her again in her office, and I simply told her that I didn't expect her to treat me with any special treatment, but that I did expect her to treat me with the same level of respect she would any other student in her class. And when I think about that story, I often think it could have been different. It could have been different if my mother didn't raise me to have expectations of myself. It could have been different if my resource room teacher in high school, Mr. Newstetter, didn't have expectations for me while I was a student in high school. Both my mother and Mrs. Newstetter encouraged me to participate in my IEP meetings. And through my IEP meetings, I discovered how I best learned. And therefore, I discovered my voice. And I discovered that I could participate on how I was going to be educated. And as a professional that assists people to self-direct their lives, I'm acutely aware of how important it is to have expectations. How when parents and teachers and administrators lay the foundation of having expectations for students with IEPs, we encourage students to grow into their citizenships and be full participants in society. Thank you.
Sarah has done an amazing job highlighting the difference high expectations can have, not just on the individual's education, but on their entire lives. Thank you, Sarah. We'll have one more speaker on the topic of challenging objectives, and then two speakers will describe how they're supporting integrating evidence-based practices into IEPs. Our next speaker on challenging objectives, Dr. Chistopher Lemons, is an associate professor of special education at Peabody College of Vanderbilt University and a member of the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center. His research focuses on improving academic outcomes for children and adolescents with intellectual, developmental, and learning disabilities. Dr. Lemons' recent research has focused on developing and evaluating reading interventions for individuals with Down syndrome. Our speakers focusing on incorporating evidence-based practices into the IEP are Sarah Sayko, the Deputy Director of the National Center on Improving Literacy, which works to increase access to evidence-based approaches to screen, identify, and provide instructional support to students with literacy-related disabilities, including dyslexia. Sarah leads the parent and family engagement work of NCIL. She is also the West Virginia State Coordinator for the Appalachia Regional Comprehensive Center, which helps state departments of education in Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia to enhance their capacities to undertake state education initiatives successfully. And then we'll have Dr. Barbara Guy, who is the Director of Special Education for the Iowa Department of Education. In this role, she has worked with regional and local special educators to build state infrastructures and capacity to provide quality special education services and supports. Prior to her current work, Dr. Guy was Iowa's education consultant for post-secondary transition. Please welcome Dr. Lemons, Sarah Sayko, and Dr. Guy.
Hello, everybody. So I'm Chris Lemons from Vanderbilt, and first of all, I want to thank OSEP for putting on this symposium, which I think is really interesting and relevant, and thank you for inviting me to participate. So today I'm going to be talking about three primary things related to challenging goals and objectives. So you can go ahead. So the first, I'm going to talk about the implications of Andrew F. on establishing challenging goals and objectives. Then I'm going to talk about the relation between these goals and objectives and state academic standards. And then I'm going to talk about how IEPs teams can ensure that the goals and objectives are aligned with Andrew F. So first, what are the implications of Andrew F. on establishing challenging goals and objectives in IEPs? So first of all, the justices were wary of the de minimis or trivial educational benefit standards as being appropriate for evaluating FAPE, much like Mitch mentioned in his opening talk. So the words of the judges say, when all is said and done, a student offered an educational program providing merely more than de minimis progress from year to year can hardly be said to have been offered an education at all. For children with disabilities, receiving instruction at aims so low would be tantamount to sitting idly, awaiting the time they were old enough to drop out. And they emphasize that the IDEA demands more. So instead, schools now will be expected to offer a cogent and responsive explanation for the IEP and demonstrate that it is reasonably calculated to enable the child to make progress in light of her or his circumstances. So now goals and objectives must be appropriately ambitious, reasonably calculated, and challenging. So to evaluate whether goals and objectives meet these criteria, I think a few questions the IEP teams can ask themselves are the goals based on assessment data? Are they measurable? Can the IEP team monitor progress on these goals? And are they determined for the individual children by members of the IEP team based on that individual child's circumstances? So some non-examples that schools would really want to avoid were, like in Andrew's case, to have the same IEP goals that the child was not meeting across multiple years with really minimal progress on those goals. Also, I think schools should be cautioned from using computerized programs that develop goals that are highly similar across many students in the school, and then also goals that are just really easy to achieve, or probably goals that are not aligned with Andrew. So it seems to me that an IEP aligned with Andrew would include some goals and objectives that were not met at the end of the annual review. So if you're meeting 100% of your goals and objectives, I think you should really ask yourself if you're really being ambitious. So when writing the goals and objectives, ask whether the team believes that if this child meets most or all of these goals, is this really meaningful and important for the child's future? So for some students with disabilities who are included in general ed classes, the proof of an appropriate educational program with appropriate educational progress is really participating in that grade level curriculum and demonstrating passing marks and moving from grade to grade. However, the court also reiterated that just meeting the standard, so passing and moving from grade to grade, was not necessarily an indication of faith. And in their words, they say if that, so passing, is not a reasonable prospect for a child, his or her IEP need not aim for grade level placement. But his educational program must be appropriately ambitious in light of her or his circumstances, just as advancement from grade to grade is appropriately ambitious for most children in the regular classroom. And I think these words really raise the bar in terms of expectations and IEP goals for children with disabilities whose goals are not currently on grade level. So next I'm going to talk about the relation between challenging goals and objectives and state academic achievement standards. So standards are written to outline a developmental trajectory through a content area. And as you can see, for example goals on the right-hand side of your screen, each of these could be an appropriate IEP goal or objective target, so a skill that we want a child to learn, or a child with a disability who's functioning at that instructional level. So standards like these, I think, can really be useful to guide an evaluation of the student's present levels of academic performance. And again, the examples on the side, you can imagine, knowing and applying grade level phonics and word analysis skills and decoding words. That is a goal target that may be appropriate for a specific student. So if you look on the next slide, you can see how we might turn a standard into an IEP goal. So if we had the standard that we want a child to segment spoken single-syllable words into their complete sequence of individual sounds or phonemes, we would want to conduct an assessment. Here, I suggested that the school use a first grade curriculum-based measure, or CPM, of phoneme segmentation fluency at the first grade level, that is this child's instructional level. And then on the median of 3 probes, Chadwick, the student, was able to provide 12 correctly segmented phonemes within 1 minute. And this provides us information that by the end of the year, a reasonable goal could be by the end of the year when presented with 3 probes from a first grade phoneme segmentation fluency CPM, Chadwick will correctly provide 45 correctly segmented phonemes in 1 minute. I think it's also to realize that this also can provide instructional information. So you can see that Chadwick is currently providing only the first sound for words. And so that's an instructional target that can help the teacher plan instruction. I think it's also useful to know that IEP teams should not feel the need to solely rely on standards to write objectives. The IEP team really should return to the language of Andrew, and as they're having conversations about the IEP goals, to return to these words and clarify whether they have a cogent, responsive explanation for the plan and whether it is really reasonably calculated for the individual child. Okay, so why is considering instructional level goals and objectives important? Well, recent meta-analysis found that in the area of reading at least, students with disabilities are currently performing 1.17 standard deviations less well than their typically developing peers. This represents about a gap of 3.3 years. So I think that it's worth considering whether writing an annual goal that represents more than 3 years worth of growth would really be seen as being defensible or achievable. And then further, writing goals that are more closely aligned to the child's current achievement level will often again provide clear guidance as to what the actual instruction or intervention should look like. So here's an analogy. So what is ambitious or reasonable for you? Can you maybe by the end of the year run a 5K, half marathon, full marathon, or are you like Yolanda Holder down here who likes to run 3,100 miles? So for each of us, we probably have a different target there. So it depends on your individual circumstances, and I think that the same should really apply to IEP goals and objectives. So how can IEP teams ensure that goals and objectives are aligned with NREF? So next slide. So Justice Roberts referred to the IEP as a fact-intensive exercise in which school personnel and the students' parents collaborate to develop and implement a special ed program for pursuing academic achievement and functional advancement. So the focus on the IEP is on the unique needs of that individual student, and it's developed only after careful consideration of the student's present levels of academic and functional performance, his or her disability, and the student's potential for growth. And instructional changes must be made when data indicate a lack of progress. And so I think a process that people watching this should really learn more about is data-based individualization, or DBI. It's a research-based process for individualizing and intensifying interventions through the systematic use of assessment data, validated interventions, and research-based adaptation strategies. So data are collected in a very systematic process, and adaptations are made to that interventions if there is insufficient response. So ensuring that this process is followed as an IEP is implemented would provide support for decisions that the IEP team makes, and it would allow for a collection of data to document student response. So I think school teams that use this process would be able to defend whether their IEP aligned with NREF. On the next slide, you can see there are several resources. If you don't know a lot about DBI now, I highly encourage you to check these out. The National Center on Intensive Intervention. The Arabo Center has 2 incredible modules that are really helpful. And then there's the National Center for Leadership and Intensive Intervention. And these are 3 major investments by OSEP. And then on the last slide, references. If you have not looked at the Turnbull and Turnbull article or Yell and Bateman's article on teaching exceptional children, which both provide a really nice accessible overview of the interface, I encourage you to get those. Okay? Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Today I'll be talking to you about how to incorporate evidence-based literacy practices into the IEP, and in particular, focusing on key considerations for that process. We'll begin by talking about a fundamental question, which is what literacy skills should be taught. To answer that question, we can look to the early grades, which provides the most robust research evidence to answer this question. And it also becomes especially important for children with literacy disabilities. Those key practices are related to foundational reading skills. There are a series of 4 critical skills that should be taught for effective and adequate reading instruction for children with reading disabilities. This includes teaching children academic language skills, and that includes more than just vocabulary development, but instruction in the system of our language, which is also focused on inferential and narrative language skills. A second critical skill is developing students' awareness of the speech sounds in language. That includes how to manipulate speech sounds and the focus of the relationship between those sounds and letters. It also includes a focus on word building activities that develop children's phonemic awareness, which is especially important for children with reading disabilities. Another important skill is to teach students to decode words, analyze word parts, and write and recognize words. This includes focusing on teaching students to blend letter sounds together, to be able to recognize word patterns, to spell those word patterns, and to read decodable words and learn non-decodable words in the context of reading connected text. And connected text is the 4th and final key foundational reading skills for children in grade K through 3, which really supports accurate word reading. It also provides an opportunity for the teacher to listen to the child reading orally and provide corrective feedback in the context of accurate and efficient word identification. So really understanding what these key literacy skills are in the early grades is important. And there's 2 implications for knowing this answer. The first one is to think about what valid measures are being used to help determine a student's progress in relation to these skills, or to determine their current performance in relation to these skills. And the second implication is how well or to what degree do the interventions being implemented align to the child's literacy skill needs in these particular areas. And when it's determined that a child's response to the instruction is insufficient, then we can look to ways to intensify the interventions. And there are specific methods that we can go about to doing that. Next slide, please. So not only do children with reading disabilities require more explicit instruction, but they really have gaps in their phonological domain compared to their typical peers. And because they acquire that knowledge more slowly, they really need more explicit instruction in the foundational reading skills. So the first variable that we can consider to alter, whether through selecting an intervention to implement or looking to the supports and services that are being provided within the IEP, is to look at the level of explicitness. And this includes things such as a clear educator explanation of the skill or knowledge to be built, modeling and guided practice opportunities, and also opportunities for the teacher to provide feedback to the child as the child applies that concept on their own or skills on their own. The second variable that can be altered is increased frequency or duration of learning time. So when we think of the learning time, we're talking about how often the intervention occurs, also the length of the intervention session, and finally, the duration of the intervention as a whole. So we can think about altering decisions to learning time by thinking about how far below is the student's performance in relation to the grade level expectations. And also think about the length and frequency of previous interventions that have already been implemented, as well as student and school factors. Another important variable that can be altered to help provide specialized designed instruction is to reduce the instructional group size. So research shows that approximately a group size of 2 to 4 is sufficient, as well as one-on-one instruction. So when the group size is reduced, teacher attention can be divided between fewer students, and so children have the opportunity not just to provide more response, but also the teacher has more opportunity to react to that response. Also, another variable is to increase the amount of response opportunities and corrective feedback. Feedback from teachers in that context should be specific and descriptive, so the child understands what he or she is doing in relation to the goal. And also that those student learning opportunities are concrete and include a wide range of mechanisms in order to show what they're learning within the context of that instruction and intervention. The final variable to consider when intensifying interventions is to increase the amount of practice and review. So intervention should provide frequent opportunities for student practice, response, and feedback. And also, in addition to that judicious review of previously learned skills and frequent opportunities to practice, there should be opportunities to practice correctly. And that includes a real explicit focus on teaching to transfer. So one could ask oneself, to what degree is the intervention being implemented provide adequate opportunities for children to transfer skills learning in the intervention context into other contexts or situations. Next slide, please. So when we think about intensifying interventions, we want to think about those types of variables that can be altered so that we can better improve the alignment between what happens in the classroom, what happens in the intervention context, and ultimately help the child be on a trajectory for achieving that annual goal by the end of the year. And so we can look to some examples of what a strong literacy goal might look like in an IEP. So here's an example of a 3rd grade student, and we see that it reflects their present level of performance as well as their annual goal and, if necessary, objective. It focuses on being specific, quantifiable, and measurable, and it is based on the connection between the child's current level of literacy performance and what we hope that child achieves by the end of the year. So if that child is not on target to achieve that annual goal, we can look back to these alterable variables that I shared before to have a conversation about to what degree do we need to make modifications to those variables so that the individualized instruction is best suited for that child's needs and ultimately helps him or her to achieve that annual goal. Thank you.
As state director of special education in Iowa over the past 5 years, I have been collecting representations of I, the letter I, or in some cases pictures of eyes. These are a couple of my favorite. since I am from Iowa, I had to have two of our regions represented. If you're from our other regions, University of Northern Iowa, your I is not predominant enough. But the reason we've been doing this in Iowa is we've recognized that we somehow, in the process of trying to ensure quality services and success for students with disabilities, we lost a focus on individualization and we lost a focus on instruction. So in the past 5 years, we've really been trying to reemphasize that and create space where both of these are easier to do. So in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to quickly talk you through just a little background on how we got here, the conversations we've been having in our state. Also give you an overview of what our state systemic improvement plan and our state personnel development grant work is. Those are 100% compatible in our state. We're also, I'm going to talk to you, hopefully spend most of my time talking about lessons for learning. The purpose of the other slide, if you'll go back, was also a visual prompt for me to tell you that the work I'm talking about is because of the Iowans who have contributed to this. We have a lot of parents, our PTI, our area education agencies, so our local education agencies, individuals with disabilities, for a number of years have done this work and are working hard. So nothing I say today is possible without the work of Iowans. Thank you. Now for the background, we really began in July 2013 when a group of us, our area education agencies, so our regional agencies that each have a director of special education, there are 9 of them, they and a number of representatives of the Department of Education got together and we said, let's measure the effectiveness of specially designed instruction. And we came to the recognition that despite the cumulative work of probably, millions of years of expertise that were represented in that room, we couldn't agree on one behavioral measure that we could go in and look at to define whether or not our specially designed instruction in Iowa was effective. So through conversation and at that very meeting, we identified 11 components of specially designed instruction, and then we took that out to the state and we talked with stakeholders and they worked with us and we refined that to a framework that I'm going to share with you in a little bit. And that, luckily for us, became the focus in 2015 of our state personnel development grant and our state systemic improvement plan. We are currently in the 3rd year of its development implementation because we're learning that while we think we have the answer, sometimes as we implement, we learn we need to develop these things. So this is, I know, very difficult to read. It is a representation of the framework for specially designed instruction in Iowa, and I'm going to read across. Each of those colors represents one of the 4 components of specially designed instruction in Iowa. The first one says diagnose for instructional delivery. The blue column there is design for instructional delivery. And the 3rd column is to deliver for student or learner engagement. And the green at the bottom is to engage for learner results. Before you flip that slide on, I want to point out that there's some language in here that really applies to Iowa. So at the top, if you have really great eyes, you might be reading under diagnose. It says use riot and skill in order to. Riot is our acronym for reviewing, interviewing, observing, and testing. And underneath each of those columns, there are 9 critical features that are, while they look linear, are interrelated. And then the green that goes across at the bottom is really talking about what teachers and parents and families need to do together to support students so that they are engaged in their learning and successful learners. I think the other piece that's important to tell you about our framework from this slide is that it's content-free. We intentionally designed it to be neutral so that we could start with one content area, which I'll share with you in a minute, is literacy, but that as we get the structures and processes developed, that we can add new content into it. So for example, while we are now engaged 3 years in the work of literacy, we are beginning to talk about what would this look like for social engagement, and especially being used with students who are on the spectrum. And the beauty of it from our perspective is that it's not earth-shattering, but it gives a teacher language So the teacher is doing the same thing with all of the students regardless of the characteristics, but maybe going to different resources to complete this simple task analysis. So we're gonna flip real quickly here. Go one more, please. The work that we're doing is in our SPDIG is in 3 areas of focus: preschool, significant disabilities, and K-6. We are embedding accessible educational materials in that, and I'll talk about that in a minute in terms of lessons learned. We are currently in 102 usability sites. Usability being those sites who are partnering with us to try to figure something out, and cohort sites being those sites who are trying our package. We have structures we're building that will last beyond the grant, beyond our OSEP, which are design teams who develop the content, a delivery and support team which coordinates the professional learning across the state, and a network of coaches. There are 3 things that I want to talk about with you today in terms of the lessons learned. And it's actually the lessons we're learning because we haven't reached the stage of generalization on these 3 things. We continue to keep learning about them. One, as we try to align both within the content of special education and outside of special education and align with our general education efforts, it's messy and probably the most difficult work I've ever done. And while a plan is necessary, adaptation is essential. And lastly, this is a new one for me, we can't measure the effectiveness of specially designed instruction in any one method, unit, variable, or indicator. So alignment is messy and very difficult. What I mean by that is 3 examples of that for you is in terms of content rich, we have built wonderful depths of knowledge within education overall and in special education. But that gets, when we try to apply that across all those content areas for one individual student or one individual teacher or a district or a building, it's cumbersome. And it's hard to get people out of or able to let go of elements of their learning. And I think the best example of that is I'm talking about our learning is we look at across our 3 strands of preschool, significant disabilities, and K-6. There are many things that we do, but there are so many things that we feel like we have to do in using the terminology we have rather than that crosses across characteristics of students. Oh, so you'll go back, sorry. The meaning of access is as we try to get our AIM materials involved, we had a separate team looking at AIM, and what we realized is once again with that content rich, the scaffolding was too deep, so now we're trying to teach it embedded within. And the strategies we have for alignment are really difficult and cumbersome because the most successful ones right now is having the same people on multiple committees, and that just doesn't work very well. So the slides aren't advancing, but I do want to say that when we talk about strategies, we did talk about that adaptation. The piece about a plan and having adaptations that's important is that when you talk about 3 years adaptation, we had planned to have, I'm not going to go, I'm going to skip the adaptation and we'll go there. Good. There we go. Everything takes longer. It takes 3 years to develop. We thought we could do it in a year and then move to scale up. Capacity building of coaches. We heard this from the literature and we ignored it. I would say to you, don't ignore this. Let your coaches learn before you start working with districts, because when they learn together, everybody is frustrated. You will not save time by trying to do that. Also, I would encourage you to think about the unit of change being a district rather than a building. And I'm going to say that scale up, people are going to want you to get to scale up faster than you're ready to go. We can go to the next slide. Here's the important piece for me. Effective specially designed instruction starts with how did you diagnose? Did you identify the right skill? Did you do a comprehensive assessment? Did you then link that to a strategy that's been proven effective to make that change? Did you then design a way to provide that strategy and actually provide it in the classroom? And then what's the result of that? So the only way we can effectively design effectively measure specially designed instruction is through a comprehensive assessment that includes an interview with the teacher and observation and student result, and probably some review documents as well. And if we'll go to the last slide, this is a paraphrase from Sir Ken Robinson, but I truly believe in what we're learning in the work in Iowa is that we cannot fulfill the promise of specially designed instruction unless we share a belief of expectations so that we all expect high things of all students and ourselves in providing that instruction, that we all believe, general and special educators, that our purpose is to teach students so that they're successful, and we believe that we are responsible for ensuring that they have a successful outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb. Thank you to our speakers for providing such great insight on what challenging objectives might mean, and also to our speakers who described their roles in supporting educators in incorporating evidence-based practices. For our final section prior to the Q&A, I'd like to introduce two speakers who will describe how families can and should be co-creators in the process of developing a high-quality IEP. Dr. Milagros Santos is a professor in the Department of Special Education at the University of Illinois. Her research focuses on young children with disabilities and their families within the context of early intervention and early childhood special education services. Specifically, she's interested in developing an understanding of the ecologic influence of families and culture on parents and professionals in facilitating young children's development and learning. We also have Melody Arabo. She's a third grade teacher at Keith Elementary School in West Bloomfield, Michigan. She held a hybrid role in the Walled Lake Consolidated School District as both a 14-year classroom teacher and district leadership developer. Ms. Arabo is the 2015 Michigan Teacher of the Year and plays an active role in her school and local community. She facilitates professional development in a range of topics, including implementation of state standards, reading comprehension strategies with an emphasis on metacognition, math fact fluency, and her biggest passion, bullying prevention, an area in which she has published multiple books. We are so pleased to have Dr. Milagros Santos and Melody Arabo.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to speak today at this webinar. So, to the next slide. My part of this conversation focuses on the importance of homeschool partnerships when developing and implementing high-quality IEPs. My goals are to engage you in a conversation around why collaborating families is critical in the IEP process, what research tells us about family professional collaboration, and how that knowledge translates to our everyday practice in the field. Next slide. So let's start by taking a step back on what we do in our respective programs to involve and engage families in activities, programs in your schools or centers, and take a moment to share your ideas on the chat or in the Q&A pod that's right there on your screen. So I think people are probably typing in, and we'll catch up on that as we go along. So our speakers earlier have shared a lot about the Andrew case, and I'm not going to repeat what they've said, other than to say that the decision on the NREF versus Douglas County School District highlights the important roles parents and family members play in the IEP development process. Now, the FAQ released by OSEP emphasizes the input of parents and family members is integral to ensuring that the spirit of the law is met. An important point I want to make is that what is included in this ruling is not anything different than what we already know and believe, particularly around the role families play in the IEP development. In fact, in many ways, the emphasis placed on the need for families to be active participants in the IEP process affirms what we value as a field, what we already know from research and practice. If you have not had a chance to review the FAQ yet that folks have put out, I found it very informative, and I think you will too. as you move forward to ensure that your program is meeting the requirements of this new movement. So next slide. So borrowing from Simon Sinek's ideas, let's start our conversation with why. Why is involving families in the IEP development important? Why should we gather input from families in IEP development? Based on the core values we hold in our contemporary society and evidence from decades of empirical studies, we know for a fact that in the majority of circumstances, families are the constant in the lives of individuals with disabilities. Regardless of the age of or group of children that you work with, whether they're infants or toddlers, elementary age, middle schoolers, secondary ed, and beyond, each of these children, each of these students grow up. And that's what we want for them to do, right? That means that whatever we as teachers, as professionals are doing with them in the present, we must always remember that we will not be there with them in the future. And thus decisions, plans, programs we make today impact not just the individual receiving those services at this particular point in their life, also the families and caregivers who will continue to care for and be part of that individual's life as they transition to the next program. Families are the most powerful partners we can have. Consider the quantity and the quality of information they possess that can help generate meaningful IEP goals and socially valid interventions that truly matter. Just as interventions look different for each and every child, there are many ways we can work together to create goals that are individualized. And true partnerships with families can help us capitalize on those and the strengths that they bring to the table. Right? Finally, it is important for us to remember that individuals, each one of us, do not develop in a vacuum. We are all part of our social world, our families, our communities. And thus it is critical that we as teachers, providers, provide services that promote active participation of families in decision-making related to their child that leads to the development of a plan that supports families in achieving the goals that they hold for their child and other family members. Next one, please. So, are there other reasons that you can think of why families should be co-creators of IEPs? Again, take a few seconds to share your ideas on the Q&A pod. All right, so we'll
post.
Yeah, we'll keep going. All right, so as mentioned earlier, I work in the early childhood world, and in our field, we have systematically identified practices that we know based on decades of research and our collective values and professional wisdom that make practices that make a positive impact on children and their families. The DEC recommended practices are those with the highest expected leverage and impact on outcomes, provided basically the biggest bang. These practices are observable, they're not disability specific, but most importantly, they can be delivered in a lot of settings and build on, but not duplicate, standards for typical early childhood settings, such as the ones that developed by our sister organization, which is the National Association for Early Childhood and Early Education of Young Children. Practices specific to families include promoting the active participation of families in decision-making, leading the development of a service plan, as well as supporting families in achieving the goals they hold for their child and their families. Now, family practices encompass three themes, as you can see on the slide: family-centered practices, practices that treat basically families with dignity and respect, individualized, flexible, responsive to each family's unique circumstances. We also look at family capacity building practices, those that include participatory opportunities and experiences that are afforded to families that strengthen their skills and knowledge. And finally, practices that really build on collaboration, family, professional collaboration. So what does research tell us, and what does it mean to our practice? So the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the U.S. Department of Education recently released a joint policy statement on the importance of family engagement to remind programs, including Part C and Part B, to prioritize family engagement as a critical component of service delivery. The policy statement emphasizes that a child's needs cannot be fully met without engaging the family. So family engagement strategies described in the policy statement that are relevant to special education programs include establishing trusting relationships between families and professionals, supporting their connections and capabilities, and developing relationships with partners in the community to support the families. These strategies are central to our work and should be embedded within our practices with families. Family-centered practices are key to high-quality services, and that's when we're implementing these practices, we need to become partners, consultants, and problem solvers with the family, rather than experts who impart knowledge in the family. This requires a shift in our role that we need to recognize and value the expertise families bring to the table. There's also families also have reported that many times they have not been part, they don't necessarily understand their specific rights. And one of the things that we know is that we need to really be able to build the time for them to gain the information that they need at that particular moment when they need it. And so some of these things that we know from research is that we need to build time into the process to encourage ongoing discussions and not overwhelm families with all that information at one time. And finally, really supporting them through advocacy by building connections between and among families to share information with each other. So when we think about the core of partnerships, I wanted to bring up this slide because I want to talk about how communication is really at the heart of partnerships. Hancock, Beneke, and Cheatham offer us some concrete suggestions on how to support the often power imbalance that are inherent in family-professional interactions. Oftentimes we find that families are simply grateful for what they have, or that they fear losing services, or that they fear that there's a retaliation on the child. And us professionals need to become aware of how that imbalance impacts how they engage with us in the services. So thinking again, what are some of the strategies do you engage families with? What strategies or new information have you gained from all the speakers today that you would like to try in your program? Good. So, time to do that. Okay. So to summarize, families are their children's first and most important teachers, advocates, and nurturers. And as such, strong family engagement is central and not supplemental to their success. We, all of us, have the responsibility to promote and implement effective family engagement to improve children's learning, development, and wellness. And so in conclusion, one of the things I want to point out is that families really must come away from every interaction with us believing more in themselves than when we started with them. So here are some resources for you to consider as you move forward in thinking about practices that you would like to use with families. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm pleased to be here today to share my lessons learned as a general education teacher and special education parent. I've been a general education teacher in Michigan where I've taught third grade for the last 16 years. I have young twins with disabilities, and once they reached preschool age, I was shocked by how much I struggled to navigate the IEP process. I didn't know what I didn't know until I had to learn as a parent. I had students with IEPs in the past, but I relied heavily on the resource room teacher to lead, and I just followed along and gave input when needed. I never had a true understanding of what an IEP should or shouldn't be. I know I'm not the only one. I also had very limited experience with kids with disabilities, especially in the classroom. It was only after I started to pay attention that I recognized how ill-prepared I was to teach students with disabilities properly. It struck me that in over a decade of teaching, I had never had a student with cerebral palsy or Down syndrome or autism. I started questioning where those students were and why they weren't in our school with their typically developing peers. Next slide. My biggest takeaway from my experience is that there is a severe lack of preparation for general education teachers in regards to special education students. We have outdated systems and structures. Self-contained classrooms and center-based programs had prevented me and my students from opportunities to teach and learn from students with special needs. My school did not have self-contained classrooms, so my staff did not have access to the training and resources that these other schools had. I had never been trained in IDEA laws, IEP development and implementation, 504 plans, positive behavior supports, response to intervention, seclusion and restraints, or universal design for learning, all things that would benefit any student in my class. These structures lead to culture and climate issues. Because our staff and school were not equipped to teach kids with more significant disabilities, the attitude was that those students do not belong at our school and should be elsewhere. This is a reality in many places, even though 30 years of research shows the opposite. So what are the challenges that perpetuate the stifling culture and climate? General education and special education work in silos. They seem like two separate worlds. Funding is separate, training is separate, curriculum and resources are separate. For example, the resource room teachers in my district use a totally different reading curriculum than the general education teachers. I don't even know how their reading program works, but shouldn't I, so that I can support the same type of instruction in my classroom? Many times, instruction is separate. Even when students are not in self-contained classrooms, they're often pulled out of their gen ed classrooms to receive support specific to their IEPs. Their gen ed teachers do not get to see the individualized instruction they get from their resource room teachers, and that creates a barrier to collaboration. My journey as a special education parent has been truly an eye-opening experience and has definitely made me a better teacher. But through all of these hurdles, I like to focus on possibilities. First, rethinking personnel preparation is important. OSEP offers 325K discretionary grants focusing on interdisciplinary work for universities that support early childhood special education teacher or service providers. The funds require that they're trained together with general education teachers. Think of how easy that could be and how much they will learn from one another. There are approximately 40 grants funded for interdisciplinary work, reaching around $900. Next, I would love to see special education training for all educators so we can have high expectations for all students. One class in the teacher prep program like I had in college is not enough. It should be embedded throughout the preparation and throughout our careers. Ideally, we would move toward more inclusive practices like co-teaching models, push-in services, and universal design for learning techniques. Lastly, we need greater awareness and use of resources like Iris Center. It took me being a fellow with the U.S. Department of Education to learn about all of the important and valuable work that is being done at OSERS. How great would it be if all teachers knew of these resources at the beginning of their careers? I'm thrilled to see all of the progress being made here by all of the caring and committed people at the U.S. Department of Education. As both a parent and teacher, I look forward to seeing how we can bring special education and general education together even more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Melody and Dr. Milagros Santos. We've received questions for Drs. Lemons and Erickson, and we'll have them join us at the podium to respond directly to those questions. And then after that, we'll have a moderated Q&A session with Dr. Milagros Santos. She'll be joining us again, Dr. Mitchell Yell, Dr. Kelly Henderson, and Dr. Vazquez.
Okay, thank you very much. So we had one really interesting question. So Dr. Erickson and Dr. Lemons are stating to provide different recommendations regarding goals. So Dr. Erickson says, don't select goals right from standards. And Dr. Lemons gives examples of goals and objectives that are right from the standards. So what would they want to comment on the seeming discrepancy? So I think it's important to note that IEP teams can include various types of goals. And so we both provided different recommendations of what those goals could look like. So ones like I provided examples of, and ones like Karen provided, are both appropriate to include in the IEP. What is important is that the goals be ambitious, reasonably calculated, and challenging. And I think both of us agree on that. And it's important to note that goals, and even the types of goals, should also be individualized to the individual child. So this is the IEP's job, is to determine what types of goals are appropriate. I strongly agree with Karen's focus on generalization. So I would recommend that as students meet the goals like the ones I've provided examples of, so really related to standards, that as students are mastering that content, we really do need to consider developing additional goals that focus on generalizing that mastered content in a broader way to other settings and in other places throughout the school.
And I would like to add that my focus was on students who have the most significant cognitive disabilities. And by definition, one of the biggest challenges that group of students has is being able to generalize the skills that they've taught. So if I'm working with students who can master the skills in one setting and then generalize them, not the notion of generalization that means they can do the same thing with a different person in a different place, but the true notion of generalization, meaning they can take those skills to accomplish a number of different things that we taught them for in the first place, then it makes sense to have very skills-focused kinds of IEPs. But when we're talking about children who can't generalize, who find it very difficult once they've learned a skill to then take it and use it to do something else, I think we need to think differently about those skills. And part of the point I was trying to make was, I wonder if part of the reason why many students with severe cognitive disabilities appear to make all of the progress that they're going to make academically when they're children, as opposed to adolescents and young adults, is this mastery focus that we've always had. And if we had from the beginning a focus in our goals and objectives where we're teaching those skills, but the goal isn't mastery, the goal is application and use. And so part of our conversation as we were thinking about answering this question was, imagine if for students who participate in the alternate assessment based on alternate achievement standards, who have annual goals and then either benchmarks or objectives, if the annual goal really focused on the application and use of the skills, and then potentially the benchmarks and objectives could focus on the mastery of those skills, that's sort of this place where potentially we're more alike than it might have seemed on the surface as we were answering, as we were presenting.
Okay, thanks.
So thank you for joining me again for a few. Thank you for joining me again for a few questions that have come in for our participants. The first question is for Dr. Yell. The question is, does the Andrew Educational Benefit FAPE standard include both academic and behavioral progress?
Yes, it clearly does. The idea talks in many places, it recognizes that our present level statements, our ambition, our goals must address academic and functional needs, and functional needs being social skills development, behavioral issues, communication, those sorts of things. Also, it is important to recognize that when the district court actually overturned their decision in the original Andrew case, it was really because of behaviors, that the IEP did not address behaviors appropriately. So yes, indeed, it does address both academics and behaviors and any functional issues a child might have.
Thank you so much for that clarification, Dr. Yao. Next question that came in is for Dr. Henderson. So Kelly, you mentioned challenges related to trauma and foster and adoptive and kinship and other families. Can you tell us about some good resources for IEP teams and educators on trauma?
Sure, thanks for the question. As we're learning a lot more about the impact of trauma, it's fortunate that a lot of good materials and resources are out there. So I wanted to just highlight a couple that I would mention off the top of my head. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network, that's a mouthful, but the acronym is nctsn.org, has a huge number of resources designed for families as well as for professionals in the mental health field and education field, and that is largely supported by SAMHSA. Another good resource speaks to the research being done around adverse childhood experiences, which is a set of 10 experiences that children have during their youth that we find have been correlated strongly with really, unfortunately, negative outcomes if those issues are not addressed early in childhood. So those adverse childhood experiences, that research and that there are a lot of resources around that. More information about ACEs can be found at aces2high.com, aces2high.com. and a lot of really good resources for educators and for families there.
Thank you so much for providing those resources. Another question came in for Vazquez. How does the work you're doing to increase effectiveness of specially designed instruction connect to the development of the IEP?
So the one thing we know for sure is that IEP teams want to get it right. And in our past, in terms of general supervision and the technologies that were available to us, when people would ask a question, we tried to give them an answer that ended up being a little bit more black and white and more procedural than possible. And what ended up happening is people focused on getting the wording right. And as I mentioned before, we lost the individualization and the focus on instruction. So the work we've been doing really focuses on the planning and the diagnosis, going through those 4 steps of SDI, specially designed instruction, and not the documentation of it. What we're finding in working with teachers and IEP teams and actually building teams is that teachers are going back and identifying that they may not have identified the right area to work on. And so they are changing the skill area in the goal. Many times, unfortunately, because of our focus on SMART goals, we ended up writing goals we could measure and not necessarily goals that are what the skill needed for instruction. So we're finding new ways to change that or to write better goals that are linked to standards. And also we're finding or hearing from our participants that general education teachers and special education teachers are having more authentic conversations because they are around the standards and skills that students will be teaching, and they're seeing the connections better, which we think will improve participation in IEP meetings, but we're really focusing on the specially designed instruction, not the documentation in the IEP. And we're also trying to find ways in the state, I didn't talk about this, to reduce the time that's spent away from instruction. So simpler ways to develop an IEP, to write it, so that we're not spending as much time in paperwork as we were with, and one last thing on that, and then I'll let you ask your next question, which is that we're also finding that in the IEP itself, people have forgotten that that special education can be throughout the full day. So that's the piece about access. Access is about the full day, not just accessing instruction within an IEP goal.
Thank you, Barb, for those insights. The next question is actually for you again, but before we get started, I just wanted to remind everybody to speak up, myself included. So Barb, for states that have locally controlled districts, how will the SBA ensure that new FAPE requirements are being met?
I think I want to start with the fact that I disagree that these are new FAPE requirements, that it might be a new articulation or a better articulation of FAPE requirements, but I think the requirements are still, have always been there. And actually NASTE, the National Association for State Directed Special Education, wrote an amicus brief for Andrew F. that I think articulates what many states have already been doing. And if they haven't been looking at some of those things with general supervision, I think you should take a look at that brief. I also would say that OSEP's movement to results-based accountability within our monitoring side has really put a lot of attention to states on what we might be able to do to put more emphasis on results and less on the procedural side of compliance. Not that it doesn't matter to have it correct procedurally, but that if it's correct procedurally, but is it making a difference for a student, that we know we need to do something a little bit better.
Great, thank you. Now we have a question for Dr. Milagros. What's the most important thing that a family member could do at the IEP meeting?
Okay, that's a great question, and I think it's, if you think about, I guess for families, I want to say and recognize the fact that, you know, we're all busy and it's hard, but one of the things that could help families most at an IEP meeting is come prepared. And what I mean by that is really coming to a meeting with questions on hand, with ideas that they might have, but most of all, I think they need to probably get some information beforehand. So if there's a way for them to talk with a teacher or somebody in the school to ask a little bit more information, because oftentimes families come into these meetings, it's their first time coming to an IEP meeting, not understanding what the process is, and having some background, or maybe talking to another parent if there's another parent who has gone through that same process and get some more information. I think coming prepared to a meeting really will help be able to develop some questions that they might have that they can ask at the meeting. They can also then be able to think about if they want to bring an advocate with them. So perhaps there's some issues that they're not agreeing and maybe not sure if that's something that they could bring up. So having somebody with them to ask, to be able to advocate, to speak up for them, to speak on their behalf would be a great way to help prepare for that. But I think what's most important, and I think what families really bring to an IEP table is the ability to go in and share about their child, about their family. The information that they have is so important that I think we tend to, it gets diminished as the children get older, because a lot of the things that we look at when we look at a child is what happens in school, but then we forget this child, outside of the 8 hours or 6 hours that they might be in school, lives at home, and they have other things that are going on, and the family can bring that information to the teachers, to the programs when they come to the IEP meeting. So preparation, important, and then and asking questions, making sure that they really take the time to ask questions. And lastly, I want to say, when they are at the IEP meeting, I always say, take time, ask for time if you can, to consider any new information that's presented to them at the IEP meeting. I don't think parents should be compelled to sign anything right there and then if they're not prepared to be able to consent to any new information that they have not had before and have had time to consider them. And so I think to ask for that time to say, okay, let me take this home, let me get back to you tomorrow, or can I think about this for a little bit before we sign off on this? And I think, so again, be prepared, ask questions, and again, take time, ask for time if needed when that IEP meeting and presented information you're not quite sure about.
And I would just add to that great answer, and that your parent training and information centers and your community parent resource centers in your state and local area can be really helpful to preparing you as parents and helping you prepare parents and caregivers for the IEP meeting, because they have great resources and lots of training, so use those resources.
Absolutely. Thank you for just providing those really important points on how parents can be meaningful contributors in an IEP meeting. Much appreciated. So that concludes the questions that I have for you during this time. So I think that this is the end of this portion. But before we close, I just want to thank all of the speakers. Huge thank you to all of you. And then the participants. We hope that you've come away with a policy and research foundation for understanding high quality IEPs and the supports and high expectations that must be present to meet a child's individual needs. So for our next symposium, we'll explore what high quality IEPs actually mean in practice. Specifically, we'll delve deeper into what educators and leaders need to develop and implement high quality IEPs and how we can support those needs. During our last and final symposium, we'll learn about how education agencies, families, and other stakeholders are working together to develop and implement high quality IEPs. And additionally, again, thank you to all the participants for all of your questions. If your question was not answered by our panelists, we'll be sure to conclude it in the collaboration space. If you come up with a question after we close today, please log on to the collaboration space and add your question to the conversation. Also, it was just such a pleasure to be a part of this truly enriching discussion. Thank you, and we're really looking forward to the next symposium.